everyone, it's Jenna Harte here. Thank you so much for tuning in today. You know, as a writer, I get to research some really interesting things. Now, in my mysteries, I get to research different ways to kill people, which can be a little bit disconcerting to my family. But I also get to research some other fascinating things. For example, in the third book of the Valentine Mysteries, I got to research the Hope Diamond and the French Blue and all the lore and mythology that went around that blue diamond. More recently, I have written a book that's the first book of a cozy mystery series that is currently in the editing process with my publisher over at Camel Press. And I'm really excited about this book because the character in it, the main character, has a degree in folklore, and she has a deep love for stories, particularly folk tales, fairy tales, and mythology. Now, in order to write this character, I obviously needed to learn something about these things. Now, of course, like a lot of people, I knew a lot of common fairy tales and folk tales and mythology, all the ones that I learned in school or were read to me when I was growing up. But of course, if you're going to write somebody who has a degree in folklore, I needed to really go and research some more. And it has been fascinating, some of the things that I've been able to discover, because not only do I learn about how all of these stories fit in the context of the time that they're written in, the history, the culture, but I've been able to discover stories that I'd never heard before, or histories about the stories and how the stories evolved. And it has been really fascinating to learn all this stuff and then to incorporate it into the life of this character that I have been writing. I thought it would also be fun to share some of these interesting stories that I have come across in my research. And because I do love a good romance, I thought I would focus on some of these stories that had to deal with love, preferably the happy ever after ones, but a lot of fairy tales and folk tales and mythology don't actually end very well. But I right now have a list of ones that do end well that I thought I would share with you, because some of these stories you may not actually have ever heard of before. I thought I would start with the story of Cupid and Psyche. Now, you probably have heard of Cupid before because, of course, it was just recently Valentine's Day, and everybody knows about Cupid. But you may not know about the story of Cupid and Psyche, which is a love story. Now, before I tell you about this story, there's a few things I want you to keep in mind. First of all, when you think of Cupid, don't think of this guy. Instead, I want you to think of this guy. The story of Cupid and Psyche is a love story, and they do adult-like things, and so you don't want to have the image of some little baby or some little boy in your head, because that will just be really disturbing. So you don't want to do that. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that I am using the story that was written in Latin, so it uses the Roman names of the gods and not the Greek ones. Now, if you have forgotten the difference between the Greek and the Roman gods, in this case, Cupid's Greek counterpart is Eros. Venus, who is Cupid's mother, her Greek counterpart is Aphrodite, and Jupiter, who is the head honcho on Mount Olympus, his counterpart in Greek mythology is Zeus, which is a name you probably do know. But this story is written as the Latin version, and so it uses Cupid, Venus, and Jupiter as the gods in the story. Finally, this story has actually inspired artists throughout the centuries, so there is some really beautiful artwork that depicts the story of Cupid and Psyche that I'm going to share with you as I tell you the story. However, I do feel like I need to give you a warning, because apparently artists in the 18th and 19th centuries didn't think that the people back in those times wore a lot of clothes. So there is nudity in these images of Psyche and Cupid that I'm going to show you. Now, the artwork is beautiful. This is the type of artwork that is in museums, but I did want to give you a warning that there will be some nudity involved here, just in case you don't want to see it. So let's go ahead and get started with the story of Cupid and Psyche. So once upon a time, there was a king, and this king had 3 daughters, and they were all beautiful. But the youngest daughter, Psyche, was the most beautiful of them all. She was so beautiful that men came from all over the world just to look upon and admire her beauty. And they thought that she was so beautiful that they didn't even think Venus could compare. And in fact, they were so enthralled with Psyche that they stopped worshiping Venus, and her temples began to fall in disrepair. Well, as you can imagine, Venus did not like this very much. Venus liked to be worshipped, and she was particularly unhappy that it was Psyche, a mortal woman, who was taking away the spotlight from her. So Venus went to her son Cupid and told him that he needed to use his arrow to make Psyche fall in love with the most vile, despicable person that there ever was on earth. And Cupid, being a good, dutiful son, said, yeah, okay, I will go and do that. But when he first sees Psyche, he is so taken by her, as everyone is, that he cannot do that. In fact, he feels like he has been struck by his own arrow. He is just so in love with her. So he doesn't do his mom's bidding. So life goes on, and Psyche doesn't fall in love with anybody, much less a vile man. By this time, her sisters are married to kings, and Psyche is not married, and she doesn't want to get married. And interestingly enough, even though she has all these men worshiping her, none of them want to marry her. They just want to admire her. Now this worries her father, because it's his job to get her into a good marriage. So he goes to the oracle of Apollo to ask him for advice on how to get his daughter married. And the oracle tells him that he needs to dress Psyche in mourning clothes and put her at the top of a mountain, and there a feared winged serpent will come and take her away and make her his wife. Now, chances are Dad was not very happy to hear about this, but being that they were dutiful subjects of the gods, and Psyche was a trooper, she dressed up in mourning clothes, and she went up to the rock, and she sat there and waited in fear, but she waited. And soon a wind picked her up and floated her away. And when she woke, she was in a meadow, and in looking around, she saw a magnificent mansion. It had pillars of gold and walls of silver, and she was certain that this was a house created for a god. Now, because of that, and because it wasn't her house, she was a little fearful about going inside. But a voice came to her and told her that this was her house, and that anything that she wanted or needed would be provided. So she goes in, and sure enough, there are servants there who are able to meet her every need, but there is no husband, until the darkness of night he comes to her. Now it's pitch black and she cannot see him, but his voice is very calm and soothing and loving, and she finds that she is not afraid of him. So she takes him to her, and they become married. When she wakes the next morning, he's gone. And again, she spends the day having her every need met by these servants, and then that night he comes again in the darkness of night. And their lives go on like this for a little while, until one night he comes to her and he tells her that her sisters are planning to go to the rock where she disappeared, and they want to mourn her. And he tells her that she is not to reveal herself to them, because it could bring on great sorrow. Well, at first, Psyche agrees. But then the next day, when she's all alone except with her servants in the house, she misses her sister. She's lonely. And of course, she also feels bad that her sisters are mourning her when she's in fact doing very well, and she's very happy. Even though she's never actually seen her husband, she loves him, and things are good, and she just feels like it's bad to let her family mourn for her. So that night, when her husband comes to her, she is distraught, wanting to see them, and he relents and says, okay, You can see them. But he warns her not to be persuaded by anything they might do that would cause her to look upon her husband, because the only rule he has is that she is not to see him. Well, she's like, okay, I can do that. And so the next day, when her sisters go to the rock, she reveals herself, and the girls are all so happy to see each other. And Psyche brings them into her wondrous house. But as the sisters see the splendor that Psyche is living in, they grow jealous. Not just a little jealous, they grow really jealous. And they begin to question her about her husband. Now, Psyche tries to cover up the fact that she hasn't seen him, and basically she tells him he's a young man who's out hunting. And then she gives her sisters some jewels and some gold and sends them on their way. Now, that night, when her husband comes to her, he tells her that she's no longer to see them anymore. And of course, this upsets Psyche because she can't see her husband. How is it that she's supposed to go through her whole life never seeing her beloved sisters again? And of course, he relents again, but warns her that she is not to be persuaded to look upon him, or they will be separated forever. And of course, Psyche loves her husband that she's never seen ever before and doesn't want to be separated from him, so she agrees. But the next day when her sisters arrive, they are convinced that Psyche has never seen her husband, and they decide to play a trick on her by telling her that they have heard about her husband, and he is the vile, winged, feared serpent, this terrible monster that the oracle said it would be, and surely someday he would devour and kill Psyche. Well, this, of course, sows doubt in Psyche's mind, and all of a sudden she's fearful of her husband and she doesn't quite know what to do. And the sisters tell her that when he comes at night that she must kill him with a knife. And when they leave, Psyche is really torn about what to do. I mean, on the one hand, she loves her husband, and on the other hand, she's being told he's a terrible monster beast who will kill her someday. So what is she going to do? Ultimately, she decides at the very least she needs to look at him and figure out what is he. So that night, after he comes to her and he has fallen asleep, she lights a lamp and holds it up high enough that she can look upon him. And oh, how happy she is to see that it is not a winged serpent that is going to kill her, but it is the most beautiful man that she has ever seen. No, not a man. It is a god. It is Cupid. So how happy is she? She's really happy. But before she can turn out the light, so he doesn't know what she did, oil from the lamp falls and burns him. So he wakes and he realizes her betrayal. And without a word, he flies out the window and away. Now, of course, she runs after him because she doesn't want him to go away, but he tells her that they cannot be together and love cannot exist in a home where there's no trust. Well, she's pretty discouraged and pretty upset about this, but she decides, you know what, I'm going to win him back. And so she sets out on a journey to find him. In the meantime, Cupid has gone back to his mother Venus to be healed from this terrible burn that he has had. Venus, of course, is not at all happy to hear that not only did Cupid not do what she asked him to do, but he married this girl that she hates. She's not happy about that. So she locks him in the room while he is healing. In the meantime, Psyche is wandering around looking for Cupid. And she's asking the gods to help her. But the gods are like, you know what? We don't want to mess with Venus, so you're on your own. So ultimately, Psyche has to decide, you know what? I'm going to go talk to Venus myself and see what I can do. Venus, in the meantime, is so mad at Psyche that she wants to see her and exact revenge for hurting her son Cupid. So she's pretty excited when Psyche shows up and makes an appeal to her on her love for Cupid. And Venus pretends to take pity on her and says, okay, I'll help you, but you have to take care of a few tasks first. And the first task is you need to sort all these seeds. And there's millet seeds and wheat seeds and poppy seeds. There's all these seeds. It's a big pile. It's all mixed up. She needs to sort them. She needs to sort them by nightfall. And of course, it's an impossible task, and Psyche's very discouraged. But then in comes an army of ants, and they tell her, don't worry, we got this. We'll take care of it. And they sort all the seeds for her. Venus is not too happy about this, but okay, she moves on. And she tells Psyche, the next task you need to do is get wool off these special sheep. It's a golden fleece that she needs to get from these sheep that are by the river. And it's actually a very dangerous task. And when Psyche gets down there, she's so discouraged, she contemplates just throwing herself in the river and giving up. But then the voice comes from a reed that says, hey, you know, it's not all that bad. It'll be okay. Why don't you wait for the sheep to leave the woods, and then you can go in and pick the wool off the briars, which she does. And again, Venus is like, what the heck? Well, okay, here's another task. This next task is she needs to get water from a waterfall on the river Styx. And of course, the waterfall is not anything that Psyche can actually reach. So again, she's feeling discouraged, but an eagle swoops down, takes the flask, fills it with the water, and brings it back to Psyche. And of course, she's able to bring it to Venus, who again is like, what the heck is going on here? Who is helping you? So finally, she gives her another task. Venus has been very taxed in taking care of Cupid, her son, with this terrible burn, and she feels like her beauty might be waning. So she sends Psyche to the underworld to get some beauty treatment down there. She gives her a box to take. And so Psyche goes down to the underworld to get this beauty treatment. Now, on the way back, Psyche begins to think, you know what? Her beauty might be at risk here too, because she's had quite an ordeal going on, and she wants to be beautiful when she sees Cupid again. So she gets really curious about what is in this box that might help Venus's beauty, because maybe it could help her beauty. So she opens the box. And at first she's really just disappointed because the thing is empty. And then all of a sudden she's out like a light as she falls into a deep, deadly, dark sleep. In the meantime, Cupid is now healed, and he's missing his wife, and he wants to go to her. Of course, he's locked in the room. Fortunately, there's a window, and he can just fly out. So he goes, and he finds Psyche, actually not that far away, and there she is, sound asleep. He wipes the sleep from her eyes, and he puts it back in the box. And then he wakes her with a gentle prick of one of his arrows. And he tells her to take the box to his mom and everything is going to be okay. And of course, Psyche's pretty psyched about this because Cupid is telling her that they are going to be together and be happy. So she takes the box and takes it to Venus. In the meantime, Cupid is pretty fed up with his mom. And so he goes to Mount Olympus and talks to Jupiter and asks for his help in dealing with his crazy mom. And Jupiter agrees to help him. And so he has this big gathering up on Olympus of all the other gods, and he basically says that Psyche and Cupid are going to be married. He gives Psyche some ambrosia, which makes her immortal, so that they could live forever and ever and ever in love and happiness. Now, you might think that Venus would not like this, because after all, Psyche is like her enemy. She hates this girl. But in fact, Venus is actually pretty psyched about this situation, because with Psyche being immortal and living among the gods and being preoccupied with taking care of Cupid and any kids that they might have, it leaves the men of Earth not distracted by her beauty, and now they can go back to worshiping Venus the way she wants to be worshipped. So in the end, it turns out to be a win-win for everybody involved. And Cupid and Psyche go on to live happily ever after forever. So that is the story of Cupid and Psyche. Now, I'm not an expert in mythology and stories and folklore and all that kind of stuff. I just write one in a book. But when I read the story, there's always some things that sort of come to mind that make me go, or here that make me think of other stories that I've read. And I thought I would share some of those and see maybe what your thoughts are on this thing. The first is, why is Cupid always depicted as a baby or a boy? And if you were to do an image search on Eros, he's often depicted as pretty young too, although there's more images of him being more grown up than there are Cupid. But if this story is a love story, and depending on which version of the story you read, you know, they do have intimate relations, they are married. Why is he depicted as a boy? There are even some images of Cupid and Psyche together, and he looks like a little boy. It's kind of disturbing, actually. So why is that? I couldn't find a really good answer, except for one of the history sites suggested that maybe it's because he's also kind of known as a trickster. He's often sent by the other gods to play tricks and do things to other people. I mean, Venus asked him to go and deal with this pretty Psyche person that was stealing her thunder. So there's some thought that that might be why he's frequently depicted as a baby or a child. The other thing that's sort of disturbing about having him depicted as a child is the idea of the arrows and sort of the phallicness of them. I mean, we can understand why Jupiter or Zeus would want to be nice to Cupid, Eros, because we know Zeus had a thing for the ladies, and you can probably bet that Cupid was sent out frequently with those phallic-looking arrows to prick some sort of woman so that she would be susceptible to Zeus's charms. You would think being a god would be enough, but anyways, we know that Cupid was used to do that. So that's kind of weird too, to have a child sent out to do that. A little bit disturbing. There are images of Cupid and Eros as grown-up men, and that's of course how I choose to think of them in this story. Now, there's other aspects of the story that make me think of actually fairy tales that we all know about. These would be Grimm's fairy tales. For example, Venus's hatred of Psyche, because Psyche is so beautiful and everybody is just awe-inspired, makes me think of Snow White, because we remember what happens when the queen is told by the mirror that she is no longer the fairest in the land. She gets pretty angry and she makes it her mission to make sure Snow White gets dead so that she can be the fairest. Now, there are versions of the story of Cupid and Psyche in which Venus does want Psyche dead, and Cupid is the one that's supposed to do it, but of course the minute he sees her, he can't do it because he falls in love with her. The version that I have read here, which I should probably tell you is in Mythology by Edith Hamilton, does not have that. Basically, in this version, Venus just wants to ruin her life by making her get married to some vile man. But anyways, that makes me think of Snow White. There's also some talk that the origins of Beauty and the Beast may start from this story. Now, of course, Cupid was never actually a beast, but Psyche didn't know that. She was told she was going to marry this terrible winged serpent, and she is living in this house. Her husband is coming to her. She doesn't actually see him. You'd think she would be able to tell when they were in bed together that he wasn't a winged serpent, but who knows? So she didn't know, which is why her sisters were able to make her so fearful, because maybe he was this terrible, terrible monster. And then when she sees him and realizes he's not a beast, he is actually a god. So there's some thoughts that that's where the idea of Beauty and the Beast came from. And then, of course, there's Cinderella, because there's all the help. The ants help and the eagle helps. And, of course, in Cinderella, she's got birds and mice and things like that help her. And finally, Sleeping Beauty, because she's put in a deep sleep. And, of course, Cupid is able to wake her with his love. You could also equate Cupid with being kind of a fairy godmother or a fairy god husband, because you can pretty much bet, and other stories are actually much more clearer that this is the case, that Cupid is the one that tells Apollo to send them to the rock so that Cupid can then whisk her away. Cupid also helps her on her journey in finding him. And of course is the one that helps with the ants and the eagle and the sheep and all that kind of stuff. And of course he wakes her in the end. So you can kind of see him as taking on that character as well. Do I know that people who developed fairy tales later pulled from this story? No, I don't. They're just similarities. These are some of the things that I thought of when I was reading the story of Cupid and Psyche. Well, I hope that you enjoyed the story, and maybe you will read it yourself. And as I said, there's a variety of versions of this story depending on what book you are reading. And if you have another version that you heard about or are interested in, or if you have any comments about the story or my thoughts about the story, I would love to hear them below in the comments. Also, if you want to hear more stories, because I have some that I've come across that I had never heard before until I started doing this research, and I really want to share those as well. So if you want to be sure to hear about those, please subscribe to my channel so that you will be able to see those in the future. That's it for now, and until next time, this is Jenna Harte wishing you peace, love, and happily ever after.